A few months ago, I interviewed my friend Derek Beaulieu, a really interesting writer and visual poet. And so I'd like to present you that interview. It's very casual. See, an apple, I could be eating the apple during the interview and it would seem natural. And so I didn't edit the interview because actually I like the flow of us just talking. We've worked together for a long time. I've known and admired Derek's work for ages. And so I like the flow of us just talking about his work, specifically two works of his, Aperture and Lens Flare, and they're related. Lens Flare comes out of Aperture, which itself was created from an earlier work, and you'll see, we will discuss that. So I hope you enjoy it. So actually, I was going to ask you about just did Aperture the text in there, did they appear elsewhere as black and white regular letter set?
Yeah. So the pieces in Aperture, I actually have a blog post that I did a couple years back that kind of showed the progression.
Oh, geez, okay.
Each of those were, and I can send you that link. Each of those pieces were composed black letter set on white paper.
Right.
But I knew that the next step for me, like what I wanted to do next, what I wanted to figure out was how to move these into color. And actually, because I kept talking about poems that looked like billboards, poems that looked like advertisements, poems that looked like the neon sheen of the Tokyo skyline. And it's like, that's all great, but these are black poems on white paper. I know that you're being aspirational here, but it's still just black ink on white paper, man.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had this suite of poems, this manuscript, and submitted it to Anthony and Clara at Penteract Press, and said, but how I imagine this is that it's got to be like day glow color, and as garish as possible. The colors have to really conflict with each other, vibrate off the page, be a little on the, I don't want matchy. I want these poems to like vibrate and really set out. And other than that, let's make it a collaborative process. Like, how do we go from there? Because despite the fact that I have, that I do this stuff and it's all visual based, my Photoshop skills are actually really terrible. Like I don't have it. So I don't have Photoshop on my computer. I use Edit, Microsoft Edit. It's just terrible. So I don't know how to recolor something. I don't know how to do this stuff. So I just gave it to them and said, what would you come up with? And more and more when I send manuscripts to presses or work with small presses or whatever, to me, that process, that publishing is it's like freezing a dialogue. Like you submit this to an editor or a publisher and they design it. They come up with something. And it's an act of trust. And once again, like what we were talking, if you get out of your own way and just be like, I want to offer these things to you and see how you reply back. Some presses, the shape of the conversation means it's going to look like a book. It's going to be, black ink on white paper in this binding, and it's going to look like that. Some presses start to stretch those boundaries, whether that be trim size or binding or color. And Penteract had really leaned into color. So I was like, let's make each one of these pages as colorful as humanly possible. And let's just see how we can, make these really do something strange.
It's really interesting how you're able to shuffle off a lot of the work that you should be doing yourself. No, it's really interesting. It's really interesting that, you talk about the work when you create work, it not being yours, and it's implicit, like the best response, the Margaret Avison thing, the best response to a poem is another poem, but right at the level of publishing it, it's collaborative, like it's built in, it's baked into the work itself, is that it is something so integral to visual work, color. You entered into a collaborative process to have that happen.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in a lot of ways, I could learn the skills and I could do all this stuff. I could put it in the color, I could, and just make that part of my own process. But I'm way more interested, and you said before, I want to be bewildered in writing. I'm way more interested in hearing what any of my writing inspires, like what happens when I do get out of my own way entirely and surrender control. And just like, I put this thing out there and I just keep surrendering control. Just like I get away, I take away all the baffles or restrictions in terms of what it should look like or shouldn't look like, and allow the process to be like embedded in surprise, that what happens, and that's how I end up, for me, what that does is it teaches me writing. It teaches me how to be a writer, how to be a reader, how to be an editor, how to be a publisher. Like it's by lifting all the restraints and saying, I step back into a complete surrender into process, and a complete surrender into somebody else's process.
Yes.
It's like, my process got me here, and now I have this thing, and now I just want to like wade in yours. Let's see what this does for your process. That to me teaches me way more, and I want to be a writer because I want to learn.
And how would you say that then, from the reader point of view? So there's this process that you have engaged in with Penteract, Antonia and Clara, and so now I come to this book, and it's like, oh, and that is the fact of it. I mean, it's not only because I look at it, I look at the colors, I look at the text of each page, but knowing that process was part of that. How do you imagine that the reader might come out of that?
Hope, I mean, what I want from any of this work, what I really desire, is that the book, the evidence of collaboration, will inspire more of the same. So a good book of poetry to me makes the reader and the writer, but the reader, ask questions. And maybe the first question is, what the hell is this?
Yes.
And maybe the second question is, and what do I do with it?
Yeah.
And then, if you have an engaged reader, and I know a lot of this is idealistic and utopian, but ideally to me, if a reader can get past what is this and into what do I do with it, my hope would be you Margaret Avison the heck out of it. You like, the best response to a poem is another poem. You write back.
Yeah.
Even if you write me and go, this is horseshit.
Right.
What do you think you're doing? Fine, but respond. But in my idealistic self, it pushes other writers and other readers to say, what's the best response to this? How do I critique? How do I write back? What is the poem that speaks back to a poem that looks like this? And what does writing become if writing is suddenly this day-glow fragments of letters that are just kind of frozen?
Because to me, it also, I wonder about, it's like, oh, if it can be collaborative, that means me as a reader, I'm part of I can be part of this collaboration too.
Right.
Not only in creating work, but I guess in constructing a response, constructing a reading of it, like understanding. So I'm part of it, is that I can read this the way I want. I can enter into it as a the third part or the fourth, whatever part of, but
Yeah.
however many people as part of that experience, and that is because then I become equal. Whether they're writing back to tell you it's terrible, whether they're just sitting there and enjoying it's pretty, or whether they're thinking through, in the relationship to mark making and the history of the avant-garde or whatever. It just feels like everybody is, if everybody's on the team, as opposed to Derek from on high, I'm going to beam down my great work.
Yeah, exactly. The least interesting thing in this process to me is what I have to say. The most interesting is what everybody else has to say. And so, it's the same thing like, why are all these pieces available online as why do I download all my books as PDFs? So that they can circulate freely without place of purchase or cost of purchase or connectivity into a community. You can only find this, you can met this small press publisher on this scene at this day. All of that starts to disappear. That sense of scarcity or limitation starts to disappear. And the work starts, I joke that it acts like, a college student, right? You go off to college and, you let your kid go off to college and they get something pierced and they dye their hair and they date somebody you think they shouldn't, and they get an STD or whatever, and they come home and they're way more interesting when they come home than when they left. There's all sorts of stuff that you suddenly have to learn about them, right?
What's the BP line about that in the Martyrology 5? It's like, I can't remember which way around it is, but College Street. So Beverly goes to college and becomes George, or is it George goes to college and becomes Beverly? I forget which way, but you just like become yourself after this experience, right?
Yeah, yeah. And that the writer then, once again, gets out of the way and removes that sense of exclusivity, that sense of preciousness, that sense of that writing only comes from writing. I'm a writer. It ends up being in dialogue, so that, post stuff online, and I get emails from total strangers, never met this person before in my life, saying, saw your work online, loved it, I'm getting a tattoo to my arm. I'm like, what? Or I embroidered it on my shoes, or I created a t-shirt out of it, or can I use this on a poster for my band, or whatever. It was like, yes. And what happens if the act of writing is just this constant sense of saying yes to potentiality and just getting out of the text way? Where does this writing want to be? That I wouldn't have even thought of.
Right.
And because then when it comes back and it's like, hey, Dad, I was on a t-shirt. I'm like,
right. Yeah.
Hey, that's a great idea. I should have done that. T-shirts, that would have been cool. Or, or whatever. And it's like,
right.
Then I start learning more and more about how readers see this work and where they think this form should be. We're like, a book's cool, but it's better as a tattoo. I'm like, absolutely right. Or it's better as a t-shirt or a band poster or whatever. I'm like, yes. Or projected on the side of a building or whatever.
Yeah, right.
That's cool. And then it starts asking me, it makes me ask, well, what did I think a poem was?
Right.
And what did I think a poem was? Why did I think it had to be on the page? And if it doesn't have to be on the page, it can be projected on the side of a building or tattooed on somebody's ass. Now what?
It's also what is this poem, right? Like, not only poems in general, but like, I thought this poem was this, but actually it includes, I think part of the, not only includes the tattoo and the picture and the on the wall and on the t-shirt and everything, but it's also this process of filtering through culture and filtering through people's minds to various places.
And it's also the reaching out. It's also the people who have done that, the tattoo, the t-shirt, whatever, who have then reached back and said, hello, introducing themselves, introducing what they think, why they thought they do this from that.
Right.
And the great ones are when they don't ask, may I? They come back with like, I did this. And it's like,
get that tattoo taken off your...
Yeah, I hope it's okay. I'm like, how on earth could I say no? But it means that part of the poem, the barnacles on the side of the ship of this poem now include correspondence.
Yeah, yeah,
And introductions and all this other stuff of negotiated conversations around, I did this, I hope it's okay, or I did this, but I changed the colors. And it's just like, it's this whole thing that starts surrounding the poem. None of it is, the shells are totally permeable, right? None of
yeah,
it calcifies the poem and holds it still. It
yeah.
must be. It's like, no, and writing comes from other writing. Writing comes from reading. And I can't imagine what could be cooler as a poet than hearing from people saying, I loved your poem and I wrote back to you. A
Yeah.
fan letter. A
Yeah.
fan letter is so cool. Like, what could be better than that? It's obviously not the money. We're not doing it for that. We're not doing it for the money. We're not doing it for the fame. We're not doing any of those things. We're in it for the friendships and the conversation and the surprise, the bewilderment, the eye opening, the eyebrow raising, the whatever. That's.
But if while they're writing a fan letter, they want to send $10 in the envelope as well, yeah,
hey,
that's
sure.
okay.
Of course.
But it does sound like it's getting back to like earlier forms of what is it, like folktale, like earlier forms of pre-industrial, pre-capitalism ideas of what art is, what an idea is, what an artist is, like how a story can be as a folktale or as a myth, or even a piece of music that gets rewritten. It was a violin concerto, it becomes a harpsichord concerto. It was by somebody else, and like it's a different notion of what. There aren't the same kind of what's the word, like it's like a title deed to it. Not just copyright, but like there's got boundaries. It doesn't have those boundaries anymore. It's malleable, a thing, an idea in the world. And an artist as well then is somebody who makes rather than somebody who fixes.
Yeah. They're not fixed in place. Absolutely. And I think that a lot of like this has a lot of historic precedent. I mean, a lot of poets would say that, like, what is the conception of the poem? What is, like, how do we conceive of what a poem can be? Or you get experimental poets who are like, poems can just be sound, a sound poem or a visual poem or a performative poem or a video poem or Duchamp saying, this snow shovel is a piece of art. It's the poet's job to me to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
But that inherently suggests that somebody has to answer them.
Right.
And one of the fun questions I like to ask is, what do we do with this? And not just, is it a poem or not? Yes, no. Is it good? Is it bad? But what do we do with this?
Right.
It's like Play-Doh. Here's a big blob of Play-Doh. What do we do with this? I made the Play-Doh. I mixed the flour in the water and put in the food coloring. And here's a big blob of blue stuff. What do you want to make?
It makes me think of like John Cage and his not only removing the intentionality, but I mean intentionality. I mean, maybe at a later stage, like you make this thing and then it becomes the poem becomes almost like not a set of instructions, but an occasion to facilitate creativity, whether it's a creative response or just some kind of creative engagement with this thing that you've sent out in the world.
And I agree. And I think one of the challenges with people's reception of Cage is that there is a sense that what he's saying is that anything goes. You can do anything and it could be music, or you can do anything and it can be a poem. And he's not quite saying that. He's still saying it has to be thoughtful, it has to be engaged, it has to be defendable, it has to be engaged with what is music and why. It's not just like, fart in a windstorm. We're like, hey, whatever. Yeah, it's a poem because I said it was a poem. That's not what Cage is saying. And he's actually saying, like, challenge challenge your and the writer's expectations of what a piece of music or a poem could be thoughtfully, see where the edges of your thinking are. And it's not just free will, it's surrendering into a thoughtful conversation. And it could be a thoughtful conversation with chance. It could be a thoughtful conversation with the Ching. It could be a thoughtful conversation with an orchestra or a group of musicians. But it's not, and like when you read his writing and you hear how frustrated he is when he presents a score to a group of musicians who treat it as a dismissible moment.
Yeah.
It's like, I'll present you with a playground and there's a whole viable series of responses, but burning the playground down is not one of the options.
Yeah, because presenting it is, it's a matter of I respect you. I really want to engage with you and have a thoughtful play with you, like thoughtful, thoughtful investigation, or like we're working through this thing together, and that's actually giving you more respect rather than, like I'm not even going to give you notes because I don't care. No, actually, that's not what he's.
Yeah, and it's actually a moment of incredible trust.
Yeah, yeah.
An incredible amount of like vulnerability, an incredible amount of trust, but it also imbues, for Cage, in my opinion, it also imbues an incredible sense of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
That somebody is coming to you in a total armor off, total like position of trust and vulnerability. I made this thing and I want to talk about it with you.
Yeah, yeah.
And I believe that the best way of responding to that trust and vulnerability is with a responsibility to meet it the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And when you read Cage get frustrated with that, with a glib response, it's because the people he is presenting this material to aren't meeting it with that sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
They're seeing trust, if I had to extrapolate, they're seeing trust and vulnerability as weakness.
Yeah.
Or lack of engagement, or glibness, when it's in fact it's none of those things. It's like I said, it's a massive amount of trust. And when we start trusting our audience, then to me, that's where I want to be as a writer. That's what excites me.
Because I mean, I think that not only the open or the gifting of an opportunity to the audience, but in terms of that respect and that trust that they will engage thoughtfully, that I see that as part of your work. You could write a straight poem that does all the work for them. Like, sure. But that's, I mean, not only are you not interested, but I do see in your work, as you said, that kind of utopian idea of, that Cagean idea of allowing them to be like an equal collaborator with you, and then to choose what to make of the work and choose how to respond. And that is that's a trust in people, I think, right? And a trust in what art can do, or what art is, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Art.
And I mean, I see similar things, in the discussion that you and I have been having for years. You and I have collaborated, but the way you're collaborating with other younger poets as well is a sense of curiosity and a sense of play, but it's also a huge amount of trust.
Yeah, yeah.
And a willingness to be vulnerable. And I love how that starts to change what the role of the reader is too.
Yeah.
Because then the reader is presented with this moment of trust. It's like, it's not, ideally, it's not just, you'll meet this in the same way, that it's not just like, we made this thing out of Lego, don't touch.
Yeah.
Just look at it behind glass. It's a beautiful thing, don't touch. It's like, we made this stuff out of Lego, grab a piece, and what do we do with this? That is I think it is a poetic position, a philosophical position around creativity that not a lot of other writers or a lot of critics necessarily know what to do with.
Hmm.
They see it as, at times, I think they see it as eroding the artist's role,
Yeah.
as undercutting an economic investment in arts. That, when I argue that poets should give their work away, some people were offended because it suggests that, like, no, I deserve to make a living too. And I'm like, of course you do.
Yeah.
I didn't say you can't sell your books. I did not say never, ever, ever charge.
Right.
My books are all for sale.
Yeah.
But they're also available online.
Yeah.
Help yourself. And that to me, that's the fun spot. I mean, that's where we can really start to ask ourselves questions as writers about what writing is. When it doesn't have to, I mean, of course, it's in work like this, sales are not necessarily the issue. We're not making money off of being a poet.
Yeah.
That's pretty rare, pretty unusual. And I think a lot of younger writers in particular are really hung up on that. They want to write the bestseller. They want to write the award winner. They want to, get the big check. That's all wonderful. Who wouldn't? But if you're writing it just to make money, then where's the fun?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where's the fun? Where's the camaraderie? Where's the surprise? Where's all the things that utopian me believes that those writers became writers for? They became writers because they wanted to ask questions. They wanted to hang out with the other cool writers. They wanted to, do all those things. It's like, great. Good writing asks questions. Good writing doesn't necessarily equal selling books. It means asking questions.
Yeah.
And what questions are you choosing to ask?
I also see, I mean, it's in what you're saying, that process is an important part of it, like the process of creating, but the process of engaging readers and collaborators. I mean, so that the books and the works that we see are almost like reports from along the process reports as the work is, Yeah.
Absolutely. Any of these things, they're writing's never finished, it's just abandoned. These are all just they're checkpoints. They're just like momentary check-ins. It's like, okay, this is, go back to B.P. Nickel. This is an apprenticeship to language. This is a lifelong. This is a lifelong poem. This is this is an apprenticeship with language. And every little while, I send in a report. This is what I learned. This is where I'm at.
Yeah.
And it's a check-in. And what do we do next? I don't know. We build on this. So the books end up being in response, reply, and constant growth with each other. And they all just display where the thinking gets to at that point. So it's a progress of thinking. It's a postcard on the route, as you're traveling along through the lands of poetics. And they're missives home. They're messages. They're letters in a bottle.
This project with, Aperture and then Lens Flare is sort of perfect like that, because it embodies all of those things. Because Aperture is, you have you made Letraset works. They were then in finding a manifestation in publishing it at Panteract. The color was added, and it became this suite of color poems. And then for the next book, the same images became part of another collaboration with Reese Farrell, right? And so that but before we get to that, because I think that's also, it illustrates exactly what you're talking about, not surprisingly, given that you're talking about your own work and this is your work. So very good. But no, and I think it's really fascinating, them taken as two aspects of the same work, or like two postcards along the way. I mean, I think that's exactly, and the openness to collaboration and transformation and investigating different things. But before we get to that, I just wanted to like talk maybe a little bit about like a closer reading of this just for a second, of Aperture. Because one thing that I find really interesting, you've worked with letter set for a long time, but so a couple things, that this letter set is highly degraded, so it's cracking apart, it's broken, there's not that many actual letter forms that are not broken up. So I'm seeing the tactility, the materiality of the medium you're working in, and so I see built into the into the letter set. I mean, time is passing. Physical things happen to things happen to physical objects. Like letter set dries out, it cracks, it refuses to be full letters anymore. They're just fragments. So you have that, but then that. So that very broken up, and what was black and white, because letter set, I don't know if letter set's always black and white, but it's
you can get other colors. I've had green and red, some white, but yeah.
But it's like, you know, when you think of that letter set, you think of these things as black, like that's, you know, when I go into my Platonic cave and look on the wall, the letter set on the wall is black and white. That's you know, that's what I'm thinking. So they have that.
Plato only used black. He was a purist. Plato
you know, like it's just
cave.
Yeah, exactly, right. So you know, and I think it was Pythagoras used monotype, right? I think that was the other thing.
Of course.
But so that it's sort of this, it's tactile, and it's organic, also organic, right? Because it's an organic process. But then that is contrasted with the perfect fields of bright, like these day glow colors that are, they're not tactile and they're not organic. They're just this like absolute washes of color. And they're also, from one page to the other, they're opposites, right? They're complementary colors. So that kind of further adds to it. So, I mean, to me, that's what I'm looking at. I'm thinking about that. The first thing I get is when I'm just looking at a page, I'm getting the bright colors, but then the contrast between the organic time-based and also applied by hand, as opposed to the digital colors that are operating in a different space. I wonder if you can talk about that.
The poems that went into Aperture, I had half a dozen sheets of letter set that were pretty much done. There was very little left on the page. Most of the letters were broken and fragmented. There were maybe 2 or 3 whole letters left, but this little stack of, you know, half a dozen sheets were all very much in their last days. What was left on the page was crumbs, and very little of it was sticking well. It was this was the last of the usabilities of that stack of potential. And so what I composed in this series was, it used that and only that. So it was like, you have these sheets, you only have these sheets, and there's hardly any letters left. There's maybe little pieces and fragments and you know, a letter here, that's about it. That's all you can use. Is just, it was like, try to make a sandwich. All you have are crumbs.
Right.
Make yourself a meal. Yeah, you can eat anything you want, but it's got to be made of crumbs. And so it was like, this was, you know, I've done pieces that have focused on typefaces or on full letters or on, you know, kind of arrays of how a letter moves across the page. But this was really the leftovers, the smallest pieces left on the page. And I restricted myself to using that and only that. So it really moved away from anything that looked like, you know, this wasn't even using a letter or a punctuation mark or the smallest particles of language. This were the pieces of the smallest particles. These were the leftovers. And it was like, what can poetry do, or what could I make that intrigued me or excited me or challenged me when I started using less and less and less and less of the material. So now, like I said, it was like make a sandwich, but all you have are crumbs. Like there are very few full letters in the whole book because that's all that was left on the page.
Right.
And none of it could be if you you make an array of writing on the page and then you pick it up and it all falls off. It's like, well, that's all you've got. You've only got the pieces. And seeing that as like urban landscapes where signage or posters or whatever are being torn off of telephone poles and you just get streaks of language.
Right.
That it's very much the refuse, the rubble of language, the crumbs and the rubble. So then if you start with that, and so now I have this suite, and you're right, they're all made by hand. They're all very, certainly as Lettre said, ages, it coheres to the page, sticks down poorly. So it ends up all over your hands. And, sometimes, at the tip of your nose, it's all over the place. And it's just this, it flakes off into these little tiny wisps of language that blow across your desk. Like it's hardly anything left. But then to take these fragile rubbles, scan them, and even that they're continuing to degrade on the platen, and then hand them over to Anthony and Clara and say, plug them in.
Yep.
Basically these are neon signs that have been dragged across the street. They're broken and they're terrible. Plug them in, see what glows, and then for them to like digitize the color and crank the color way up into saturation. It was like this is the last throes of degrading neon signs. This is language is doing very little here other than calling out, and it's like I wish I still meant something. I still wish you could still get to the bathroom from this neon sign, but there's nothing here. And
I thought it was a perfect portrait of my relevance in the world. Just the crumbling bits of leftover, detritus that's just wants to mean.
Yeah. It really wants to mean. It really wants to assert its place, and there's so little cohering here. So the color ends up being these support systems, because even as we walk down the street, you see these signs that are torn down or whatever, your eye is still drawn to the color.
Yeah.
The letters have washed away, the store is closed, it's all boarded up, but you see a blue sign. I don't know what it means anymore, but your eye is drawn to the color. The color ends up doing a lot of the evocative work here. And by placing them in these corresponding panels, white on red, red on white, it's a visual rhyme, but it also suggests that kind of sign design or logo design, or what you would see on a street, because it's within the palette of capitalism. It's all hyper colored panels.
Yeah,
but they're not going anywhere. They're not inviting you in. They're not pushing you out. They just sit there as lumps of rubble. And then what? It's like, as we started looking at these things, Anthony and Clara, once again, I was like, how can we move these poems into doing some of this stuff? So we created a day glow green poster with these images isolated on them, and just allowed them to, and then started putting them online, allowed them to reproduce. And a number of artists took the pieces, ran them through Photoshop, did things, twisted them up, and then and sent them on their way. And that started to get the gears going. That started to, like, okay, what do we do with these? What happens next? And I was in correspondence. I was talking to a former student of mine, Reese Farrell. When he saw the work, he does large scale spray painted murals. And I mean, like, one of the pieces he's done is literally an entire city block. It's on the asphalt of the street. It's a city block wide and a city block long. It's the entire surface of the asphalt. And it just like continues down. Or he's done entire walls in the Calgary airport massive sides of buildings, and he saw these and he was like, man, these would be great as murals, blown up to the size of the side of a building. And I'm like,
Wow.
yes. And it was like, so how would you picture this, Reese? Like, what would you do with that? Here's the manuscript, here's the PDFs. Help yourself. What do you want to do? And we started entering. I was like, play with them. How would you imagine them? Make them into something that looks like yours.
Yeah.
And he started sending back images that basically telegraphed his thinking. And those started gathering up, little pieces I had sent him here and there. And then I was like, okay, so what happens if I send you the whole manuscript? What happens if I send you the whole thing, start to finish, and there's like 56 pages, and you respond to every single page.
Yeah.
Now what? And what kind of concerns, what kind of images, what kind of shapes start asserting themselves to you as a reader in response? And that started accumulating, and that turned into lens flare. And since then, he's taken several of those and used them as Photoshop imaginings on the sides of buildings of places. So he actually hasn't painted them mural sized, but that's in the works.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
That's bumbling around in the back of our heads that's going to happen. Where? Don't know yet, but
taking those like small degraded images, like the degraded letter set, it's broken and it's hand sized by definition, and then having that massively projected becomes something else. I mean, maybe it becomes like a billboard, like falling apart, like the paper degrading and like that kind of stuff. But it just, I mean, it's taking the small and the tact and the hand size into, and made by hand. Which is it does something else really interesting.
Yeah, and it blows the scale apart as well. And to me, that's another area of real growth for visual poets in particular, but poets of all sorts of scale. Yeah. We think of like a long poem, from the haiku.
Or what about a big poem? Is that?
Let's talk about the big poem. Long's fine. What about big? What about the size of a building? And it's not, to me, like that kind of sense of monumentality that, like, fill the world, because it's all play, and because it's all collaboration. I think a lot of the troubling of occupying that space really gets diffused too. That it doesn't come across as this big take up all the space colonialist kind of.
Yeah,
it ends up being like, let's talk about scale.
It's not Ozymandias and it's great, right? Look on Mighty in Despair, right?
Yeah. I mean, the perfect thing would be like, let's blow it up to the size of a building, paint it all over that, and then leave spray cans at its foot and say like,
right,
your turn.
Yeah. It's also, I think, having things on, never mind the size, but even just having things on walls, it's a different kind of looking, a different kind of reading. And like you point to with advertising signs and billboards, we are used to text and textual objects and logos and things on big and also on walls and out of books. But we're used to thinking of them a certain way, and we don't read them the way we read like Derek's new book of poetry. But so it opens up another kind of engagement with the same work.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we've been trained to do two things that look an awful lot alike, but aren't the same thing. One of them is reading, and the other one is looking.
Yeah.
Right? We look at a billboard, or we look at an advertisement, or we look at a street sign, but we don't read a street sign.
Yeah.
Read a book, a magazine, a piece of text, whatever. And yet, the materiality of the two things are the same. Words, letters, symbols, printed or presented. And our physical engagement with them, eyeballs, brain, also the same. But context, are you sitting? Are you standing? Are you in a private space? Are you in a public space? Are you engaging with it for amusement or direction? Are you, is it protecting you? Is it a stop sign, or is it amusing you? It's a, it's a novel. The purpose is different, but the material is the same, and how we engage with it can be playful, and I think that like it does an interesting thing to writing if it's just looking, and vice versa. If we do if we read a stop sign, or if we stare at a poem, we start applying different tools that look, like I said, that look an awful lot alike, but we've been trained to not move them from one region to the other.
I'm thinking now, in my new society, every intersection is going to have a novels on the corner, and you go into the bookstore and it'll all be like street signs. So you flip through, you have seen the latest stop sign from Stephen King? Oh man, you should see, it's like,
and I mean, you see that, on occasion you get stuff like what Stan Bevington did in BP Nickel Lane by putting a B on the side of every no parking P. And so you do get those things where it's these little poetic détournements of street signs or of looking, that the reading starts to insert itself. But I think it presents a really fun, really potential laden gift to writing for us to say, well, what if we use all these skills over here? I mean, we use them on our laptops, we use them on the internet, we use them on our tablets, we use them on our cell phones. We think about image and engaging with image. Why not come up with a writing that looks like that or acts like that? Or
absolutely. And I was thinking that I remember I once did a thing with some students at a youth center that it was part of an art event. And so we had the space. And so we made chapbooks of their poems, but we also put the poems as posters on the wall, like in an art gallery. And so people came in, and people were very happy to read the wall, to read these posters, and they read the poems. But then they could pick up a free chapbook, and it was a book, and they were kind of scared because poems and books are kind of scary, and it was the same. They were the same poems, and they genuinely, I could see them genuinely enjoying the work as they read through them, and there was lovely work from these youth. And so it in terms of one of the things that taking poems out of books do is it takes away a certain kind of cultural context. It does a kind of inadvertent cultural work that's been done by the book. I mean, I think it's interesting what it does, but it also enables other work to be done by the poems outside of the book.
Yeah, there's a cultural weight to the physicality of books that I think intimidates people. It still makes them think that there is like, oh, it has to be treated like a book. But the same thing, but on the other end, you take something and you hang it in a gallery, and outside of I think of your students' experience, but like the average length of time spent on a painting in the Tate is seconds. Seconds. 2, 3, 5, 10 seconds. Seconds. There's Full Fathom 5. There's the Mona Lisa. There's whatever. Seconds. You walk up and you're like, oh yeah, cool. Gone.
Right.
Whoa. And yet, so like reading suggests a longer, more considered private engagement with something.
Yes.
But looking suggests a shorter, public, information-based engagement with something. Right? You just look at it, you get the information you need, move on.
Right. Yeah. But there's
or
also
to make light, people don't like reading standing up.
But one of the things I think is interesting, like with public art, which would be the case as you're positing your poems out in the world, is that they go by them frequently, so that even if they're only look at them for a bit, they enter their world, they become part of their landscape. So it's over time they actually have maybe that looking turns to another kind of reading. It's just not all done in one sitting. It's you know, it evolves through time as the people do it. I on the subject of that, we should. I do want to talk about my careful reading of this book. It's very rectangular, Derek. I just
Yeah.
I think go further to what I was saying about Aperture. Like there's even more of a contrast between Reese's like op art kind of clean like lines. There are lots of bars and kind of curvy bars and big areas of color that are the opposite of your, and they're all straight edged, and whereas your letter sets are organic and broken apart and irregular, and so there's, through this sort of net of Reese's work, you can see this sort of very organic form, like language, like it's kind of like language pushing through the bars of the digital to try and express itself in all its material imperfection and embodiment, like language is embodied.
Even when you start piling art on top of it, these little fragments of language are still pushing their way through, saying, I want to point, I want to be a referent. And that was actually, as Reese was working on this, we were about halfway through, and he was like, increasingly, I said, you're being too reverent. Like, loosen up, man. Don't think that my poems have to mean anything. And you started to see, as you move through the book, you start to see these kind of weird 1970s wallpaper landscapes that start like asserting themselves. You see waves and clouds, but of course they're not waves and clouds, they're just repeated shapes. And it starts to feel more, a little bit more pastoral, but also, like I said, like it's the pastorality of my 1970s kitchen. I mean, it's like, it's the color of my stove, the color of the refrigerator, the napkins and the placemats and the tea cozy, and it's those colors start wafting in, and the poems start fading way back, but becoming these kind of like harvest sun images in the background of the wallpaper.
But there's still, it's interesting that you can mostly cover language up with these bars of color. You can let the letter forms like almost fall apart, but they're still like hanging on. I mean, it's almost, they feel a little bit like Hart Brody's little humanoid letters. Like they're like this sort of like, there's just, I mean, it's language itself like a character almost. I mean, not to narrativize it, but that's what I mean, and that's only just one. But they're just so they have such personality, and they have such sort of like strength. Like even just like the littlest fragment speaks to us. I mean, it's lighting up the language part of our brain, and with a kind of, we honor them with their bravery kind of thing, or there's pathos, or there's like all of it, feel right. And then I mean, but wait, but these are all little broken up little, not even letters. Like what's like, it's like fascinating.
Like we're engaging with these two books, and we keep calling them poetry.
Yeah.
How far can we walk away from poetry? How much distance? How little resemblance to poetry can these books have? And still be called poetry. They're still saying, well, they're a poem, and they do these things. It's like, to play devil's advocate, point at one thing in these poems that suggests that they're poems. Like there's so little here. There's not even a letter. Like there's so little here to suggest that they're poems, and yet, we keep saying they are, because they are. So then why?
Oh, absolutely.
And why is it? Well, because clearly our definition of what a poem is deeper, wider, weirder than we might think it was. Because we keep calling them that.
I mean, it's interesting. Like if you'd said, "Oh yeah, Gary, I've got this new book of artwork that I did," I wouldn't be tricked. I would know, but because I'm sophisticated like that. But So I'm just trying to see, would I read it differently? Would I think
Would you
about
read it at all?
Yeah,
Or would you
exactly.
look
Like,
at it?
right. And so if I'm looking at it, but I guess that what I feel is just the way, I mean, really the names don't matter. It's just a cool thing. So, but I mean, but I do think there's something fruitful about thinking about, this is poetry. So what does that mean? And just the way that the slightest little hint of something that looks face-like will make me think of a face. I feel like the slightest little bit of like gesturing towards language makes me think language. And that's an open signifier to all of the things that language could possibly be, or in this case, all of the things the poem could possibly be. So it doesn't take more than just like a little curve that reminds me of the little curve that might be on a comma or something.
Yeah.
And I'm right into that. I'm in language, and the language parts of my brain are lit up, and I'm thinking about, and I'm having a language experience. I don't know, have any idea what it means. That might be another interpretive thing that
Yeah.
but I certainly am. I'm engaging with it with my language. At least part of it is with my language, even including the color and all of that stuff. I'm still I'm still in poem world.
Yeah. And I mean, I love that. I like, how small a crumb can I give you and you still think sandwich? You know, like,
Yeah.
But it's also like, how, as a poet, how thrilling it is that the smallest pieces of this toolbox that we have still evokes, still points us towards poetry, still says, we get the smallest, like you said, with a curve of a comma, or the, little bit of the ascender off an F or whatever, and suddenly you're like, language, poetry.
But I also absolutely, but I also,
like, it starts to, like, it moves in that direction, and it starts, because then it starts pulling in.
And then I would, yeah, no, but then I would also say that page by page, now I'm in a book, and now I'm reading. I'm not like a sequence, like in the same sense that there's crumbs that are letters, there are crumbs that are narrative, or crumbs that are the kind of teleology of a book from beginning to end, whatever that means, or the kind of, it's just somehow I'm turning the pages and I'm going through, like you move through a book in whatever that book might reveal or open up. It does that as well.
And that's one of the things that happens with, a narrative is a passage of time.
Yeah.
But, opening a book on its first page and flipping through it to its last page is a passage of time. And it's still, a narrative will assert itself from page 1 to page 56. It'll start saying, time has passed, things have changed. This led to that because of order.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts to assert, like, not only is these crumbs of language, like you're saying, pointing towards poetry, but because it's in an ordered sequence that takes place over time, it starts to point to narrative.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe like the same kind of fragment, the narrative is as fragmented and abstracted as the letter forms are, or almost letter forms. But I'm in that world thinking about how it relates then to narrative or to sequence, like in the way poems might be in a sequence, like a suite of poems that are not, they don't tell a story, but they're somehow a sequence, and whatever's happening. I mean, I go through different phases of the book. And so the same, I feel it's the same thing with both of these books. They definitely do that.
The poem number 3 happens between 2 and 4.
But
and you know what? It responds to 2 and presages 4 in some way. Always, there is a sequence that the poems assert.
And I would say, even if this had been unbound and I just had a whole bunch, they speak, each page speaks to another page by virtue, design, by color, by so that it's not just, oh, here's just a bunch of stuff. It coheres, it has a larger level, I feel.
And I think that in some ways in this book, you're seeing Reese's narrative engagement from first page to last page.
Yeah.
It responds to it is in exactly the same order as Aperture. So it takes that narrative and, places it into a new framework. So the narrative, the sequence was asserted in the first book and then reaffirmed by Reese's engagement over it from page 1 to page 50.
Right.
Yep. Absolutely. No, and then for me, once again, it was an act of getting out of the way. That it was like, the only thing I said was like, stop being so reverent, do what you want.
Right.
And don't worry about offending me or surprising me, or you just engage with all the pages.
So go ahead.
See what happens.
I was going to say, I loved Arnold McBay did a little video of one of the pages, and so it feels like that's like here's introducing another person, and it's now it's moving through sort of Rhys Derrick space, like he's moved the thing, and it adds his kind of sensibility to that, right? So it was really,
and that's
beautiful.
That was the exciting thing, is that I was invited by Emo Press, by the publisher, to come up with some sort of reading or video poem of this, and I was like, well, the first person I thought of was Arnie.
Yeah.
And so I gave him the original piece out of Aperture and the response out of Lens Flare, and said, interested? What do you want to come up with?
Yeah.
And so he asserted that, like, once again, that kind of pastoral rollout of these clouds across the top, and the surf where the hills kind of rising from the bottom, and then breathing in and out of that space, and then brought it to you and was like, what's this sound like?
Yeah. So that was,
So now you've got these increasing layers of surprise for me, because if somebody asked me, what does this poem sound like? I'm like, I don't know, ask Gary.
Yeah. But just the fact that it's so, as you have been saying, that it's so deeply, it implies collaboration, it implies response, it invites in readers, and like in our case, create like people who are artists or musicians to respond in the way that we respond.
Yeah.
It was better because I was going to write you a really nasty note instead, saying it was all garbage, but instead Arnie asked me to write music, so that was, I thought that.
So that's what you said. Yeah.
So that's what I did. So what.
Yeah. And I mean, it takes away the authority.
And
like the authorial authority of like, this poem means this because the author said so.
Right. And you can set the boundaries of it, because
it's got to be the least interesting reading that the author could possibly say. Wouldn't you rather hear something else? Wouldn't you rather, somebody else come forward and say, well, what about this?
Yeah. I mean, but again, you are setting that, you're creating the occasion for this, right? Like, and to me, that's part of it's the work itself, but also setting that occasion is really something very exciting that you're able to do. Mm-hmm. And that's a different notion of authorship. Like the Cajun idea would be something like that too, I think. So,
well, that's my hope. And I mean, this is where my thinking takes me at the moment. And it's been slowly evolving over years, from the small press scene and the gift economy and teaching and having work in dialogue and collaborating with you, and that it starts to lead in this way. And I don't know what happens next.
Right.
And that's both as a writer. Okay, so like, what are you working on next? What's the next project? I don't know. And that's the good thing. Or even if I am writing, I don't know what it's going to look like when it's done.
Yeah.
Because it's process. It's writing is processual, and then the book thing is the evidence of thinking.
Right.
The product of poeting, of writing.
Yeah.
It's just like you said. It's these postcards back, like, been traveling and sent you, met this guy and he started doing this, and it's like, here's an image, and then we were talking about this thing, and somebody else walked in and was like, what that sounds like, and it starts to, writing should be a surprise.
And the other
but
thing,
what that leads is it makes it very difficult. It can make it very difficult for folks to talk about, because they don't necessarily know. They want to know.
Yeah.
Reader, like some readers, some writers, some critics, some responders, they want to know, what is this? Why is it this way? What is it doing? And they want certainty.
Yeah. But I think it's also, it's not what it isn't, but what is it? So to me, even if nothing else, you look at it, like they're really beautiful. The colors are beautiful. The shapes are fascinating and intriguing. And then the contrast between Reese's shapes and your shapes, the lecture set, that's like so fascinating. And then so it pulls you in, and then you're trying to okay, how can I read this, and what's one thing is different than the other, one page is different than the other, so what is happening over the difference, and how does that make me feel, or what is my appreciation of it, like a different course in a different meal or something, like as I was going back to that food analogy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, that it really is inviting in because it's beautiful, right? I mean, I think that's one thing that's apparent, that so that it, and you entered into the conversation because it's not inaccessible work as much as it's sophisticated conceptually. It's not at all inaccessible because it's just nice to look at and nice to think about.
And
I think so.
And that's the role of a poem.
Yeah.
Create, something thoughtful and pensive and beautiful, creating with the material of language.
Yeah, like keeping kind of like a nice buzzing in your head that you can, you can think about, right? Or
and if it means that you walk out in the street and start seeing the world a little differently.
Yeah.
Then perfect. And that seems, once again, like the aim of what poetry is supposed to do.
And I think, as you said, also this is also talking about the aim of what writers can do, but also what the individual can do. Then, I think, I mean, if you want to go broader and extract, like how should we be in the world? Well, this is also, to me, this is also part of it. Like, well, we should all be empowered to make stuff and to be involved and to be equal, and not to have these prophetic figures speak down to it. But we're all in this together, kind of thing, and it's about this kind of open-ended dialogue.
And to trust that dialogue, to trust each other and the conversation of each other. That, like, to enter into the conversation from that Cagean point of vulnerability, not authority, and be surprised at what happens.
And I would say that also applies to the reader. So, like, because I think it's a really good point, and maybe I haven't heard it made often enough, about the reader, or in the needs to, or in Kate's case, the listener needs to enter into it with the same kind of trust and respect and like openness to the process. Like, it doesn't just mean any person off the street. You can their knee-jerk reaction, as opposed to, okay, and it could be any person on the street, but they just need to, but you need to give them time and the space to like actually just be open to it and to respond properly, not like, wow, I think, as opposed to, wait a second, let's just engage with this for a moment, and then what you think is important.
Yeah. Upon reflection, what does this mean?
Yeah, like, given your real open, because it's easy just to, I think, like, because I think I was thinking about the on the street interviews where they often ask people and they spout off, and they're not asking people to give their really thoughtful, like, respecting in that, having really engaged, thinking about it, and then speaking from a place of that kind of generosity. It's often just a place of a knee-jerk fear, or, and I think, and which is often happens, say, with Cage's work, people would be very negative about it, rather than saying, okay, think about what you're being offered here and then respond.
Yeah, you look at 433, and the knee-jerk response is that it's a scam. So he was like, oh, yeah, you didn't even do anything. Okay, well, then just sit there in quote unquote silence that isn't silent at all, for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and see what your mind does, and then get back to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think, to me, that's the only qualification that a reader needs, is that, like, I mean, the more, okay, you can learn more, and you can be, you can have more tools, and you can have more context, but really all you need is just the ability to be open to the work, and give it, and trust it, and trust yourself.
Yeah. Right. That. Exactly. And that's where I want to be as a poet. Like, that, to me, that's where the surprise is. That's why I want to be a poet at all. Is to learn from that conversation.
Yeah.
because it's not just, it's not didactic, it's not teaching. It's not telling, it's asking.
Hmm.
And ideally the answer to the question is another question.
Hmm.
Well, what if we did this? What if it moved? What if it sounded like something? What if
Right.
we, made it bigger, made it smaller, whatever?
Yeah.
That the best questions are generative questions, that
Right.
lead to another engagement and another what if.
Yeah. Yeah.
What if we did this? What if we did that? And because those are continuing to take the boundary and push it outward and welcome a different voice or a different engagement or a different point of view, and expand the conversation. And that, once again, is, to me, the role of the poet, is to ask questions and expand the definition of what poetry is.
Hmm.
Explore the edges. But we don't have to do that alone.
Right.
Yeah, we do it together.
Yeah. And I feel part of that, if by asking those questions, is also implicitly asking what it is about being human or being alive. I mean, I think that, to me, I can't help but connect it with that, like, just very broadly, not specifically, but just in general, like to approach the world with that same attitude.
Yeah, that same openness, that same receptivity, that same humility and questioning, that same readiness to ask questions with questions.
Yeah.
That seems to only serve us well. The more questions the more sentences we have that end in question marks, and the fewer with periods or exclamations.
What's the joke with the rabbi about? It says, like, Rabbi, every time I ask you something, you always answer with a question, and the rabbi says, what else should I do?
Somehow I knew that, given an interview long enough, a conversation with Gary Barwin will always lead to a rabbi joke.
Yeah,
And it's just been like, okay, so how many minutes will it take?
That's right. Yes.
Good job. It took an hour and 36 minutes. You got
there we
there.
are. There we are. Yes. This seems maybe a good place to wrap up. That was great. That's so interesting.
I really appreciate this. I both, doing this for something, but also I just love talking.
Yeah, no, absolutely.